Section 32 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 6, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Elisabeth, Chapter 8, Part 4. Soon after Elisabeth's return from her eastern progress, the Duke of Anjou sent his favourite, Monsieur Simiers, to plead his suit to her. This envoy proved so agreeable to her Majesty that she invited him thrice a week to her private parties, and never appeared so happy as in his company. The greatest jealousy was excited among her ministers at the favour manifested by their royal mistress to the insinuating foreigner. They even suspected that she confided to him her most secret thoughts. Leicester, infuriated at the attention her Majesty bestowed on Simiers, attributed his influence to sorcery and other unhallowed arts. It was quite apparent to everyone that if Elisabeth had ever cherished undue regard for Leicester, she had conquered her passion. Her quondam governess, Mrs. Ashley, who had not changed her intriguing habits, though now in the vale of years, ventured to plead the cause of Leicester to her royal mistress, and from the nature of the reply she must have recommended the queen to marry him. "What!" exclaimed Elisabeth, with tenfold of her father's pride. "Shall I so far forget myself as to prefer a poor servant of my own making to the first princes in Christendom?" If it be true that Elisabeth actually gave a promise of marriage to Leicester in the presence of one of her ladies, Mrs. Ashley was probably the witness of the plight. Be this as it may, the declaration of her present feelings on the subject was definitive. Leicester himself had previously ventured to cross-question his royal mistress as to her intentions on the French match, and being deceived by the subtlety of her dealing into the idea that she really meant to wed the Duke of Anjou, considered his own ambitious hopes at an end, and privately married the widowed Countess of Essex, of whom he was deeply enamoured. Simiers, having penetrated this secret, gave immediate information of it to the queen, as he suspected that her regard for Leicester was the principal obstacle to her marriage with Anjou. Elisabeth was so greatly offended with Leicester that she ordered him not to stir from Greenwich Castle, and would have sent him to the Tower had she not been dissuaded by the Earl of Sussex from an action liable to construction so derogatory to her dignity as a female sovereign. Leicester, who could not forgive Simiers for his interference, has been accused of practising against his life, because one day when Simiers was attending her Majesty to her barge, not far from Greenwich, a gun was discharged from a neighbouring boat, and one of the queen's bargemen was shot through both his arms within 6 feet of the queen's person. Everyone in the barge were amazed, and the poor man bled profusely. Elisabeth did not lose her presence of mind, though she believed the shot was aimed at her life. She took off her scarf and threw it to the bargeman to bind up his wounds withal, telling him to be of good cheer, for that he should never want, for the bullet was meant for her, though it had hit him. All present admired her intrepidity, but her future conduct was still more admirable, for finding when the man, Thomas Appletree, was put upon his trial, that the piece had gone off by sheer accident, she not only pardoned him, but interceded with his master to retain him in his service. It was on this occasion that Elisabeth made the following gracious declaration: that she would not believe anything against her subjects that loving parents would not believe of their children. She, however, took the precaution of declaring by public proclamation that the French envoys and their servants were under her royal protection, and forbade any person from molesting them on peril of severe punishment. The frivolous pretence of plots against the queen's life by sorcery had recently been revived. There were found at Islington, concealed in the house of a Catholic priest, 3 waxen images of the queen and 2 of her chief counsellors, which it was said were intended to be operated upon in a diabolical manner for her destruction. Much at the same time, her Majesty was attacked with such grievous toothache that nothing could mitigate the torture she endured, and she obtained no rest either by night or day. Some persons attributed these sufferings to the malign magic that had been employed against her. Her physicians held a consultation on the royal malady, and instead of devising a remedy for her relief, fell to disputing among themselves on the cause of her indisposition, and the medicines the most advisable to use. The lords of the council then took the matter in hand, and decided on sending for an outlandish physician of the name of John Anthony Phinutus, who was celebrated for curing this agonizing pain. But as it was a perilous thing to entrust the sacred person of a sovereign, so suspicious of plots against her life by poison as Elisabeth, to the discretion of a foreign practitioner, who might possibly be a Jew or even a papist, they would not permit him to see her majesty, but required him to write his prescription. Phinutus composed a long and elaborate Latin letter in reply, declaring, in the first place, his unworthiness to come after such great physicians, and then prescribing divers remedies, but with the intimation, that if the tooth were hollow, when all was said and done, it was best to have it drawn, though at the cost of some short pain. If, however, her majesty could not bring herself to submit to the use of chirurgical instruments, of which it seems he had heard something of her abhorrence, then he advised that the juice of Chelidonius Major might be put into the tooth, and so stopped with wax, that none of it might touch the sound parts, which would so loosen the tooth that in a short time it might be pulled out with the fingers, or the root of the said plant might be rubbed upon the tooth, which would produce the same effect, but concluded by declaring that drawing the tooth was, by all, esteemed the safest and best way. The courage of the lion-hearted Elisabeth failed her on this occasion, and she expressed so much repugnance to the loss of her tooth, combined with terror of the pain that might attend the operation, that the eloquence of her whole cabinet could not prevail upon her to undergo it. Aylmer, Bishop of London, who was present at this grave debate, then stood forth, and after assuring her majesty that the pain was less than she apprehended, told her, that although he was an old man and had not many teeth to spare, she should see a practical experiment of it on himself, and thereupon bade the surgeon, who was in attendance, extract one of his teeth in her majesty's presence, which encouraged the queen to submit to the like operation. After this rich incident, some readers may possibly feel disposed to entertain doubts of the valiant temperament of the maiden queen, of which more has been said than can be demonstrated, but of her pugnacity we have sufficient evidence from contemporary record. On the 16th of June, Simiers demanded a definitive answer from the queen on the subject of his master's suit for her hand, and she replied, as she had done many times before, that she could not decide on marrying a man whom she had never seen. At this declaration, the Monsieur, as the French prince was styled in England, acted for once in his life like a man of spirit, and, to deprive the royal spinster of her last excuse for either deferring his happiness or disappointing his ambition, crossed the seas in disguise, attended by only 2 servants, and unexpectedly presented himself at the gates of Greenwich Palace, demanding permission to throw himself at her majesty's feet. Elisabeth was charmed with the romantic gallantry of her youthful wooer. His ugly nose and marred complexion were regarded, even by her dainty eye, as trivial defects, so greatly was she captivated by his sprightliness, his attention, and his flattery. She had been accustomed, from hearing his personal disadvantages exaggerated by the party who were adverse to the marriage, to think of him as a ridiculous, ill-favoured, misshapen urchin, and she found him a very bold, insinuating young man, and vastly agreeable, in spite of his ugliness. He was the first, in fact the only one, among Elizabeth's numerous train of royal lovers, who had the spirit to court in person, and the impression made by his advent appears to have been, while it lasted, such as to testify the bold step he had taken. Elizabeth was guilty of a few tender follies on his account. In one of her wardrobe books we find the following quaint entry of a toy evidently devised at this period. Item, 1 little flower of gold, with a frog thereon, and therein Monseigneur his physiognomy and a little pearl pendant. Query, was this whimsical conceit a love token from the Duke of Alençon to his royal bel-ami, and the frog designed not as a ridiculous but a sentimental allusion to his country? In the course of a few days he succeeded in ingratiating himself so thoroughly with Elisabeth that he departed with the fullest expectations of winning the august bride, for whose hand the mightiest kings, the most distinguished conquerors, and the handsomest men in Europe had contended in vain. The queen summoned her council in the beginning of October to meet and deliberate on the subject of her marriage with the Duke of Anjou. Their first debates were with each other on the unsuitableness of a union between the parties on the score of disparity of age, as the prince was but 23 and her majesty 46. The point was discussed with great freedom, it should appear. The minutes remain in Burleigh's hand, in which the opinions of the differing privy councillors are placed in opposition to each other, under the heads of perils and remedies. To say the truth, the non-contents have exceedingly the best of the argument. Amongst these, the opinion of Sir Ralph Sadler is remarkable for its uncourtier-like bluntness. The oracular sentences which he delivered were as follows: In years, the queen might be his mother. Doubtfulness of issue, more than before. Few old maids escape. Sussex and Hunsdon advocated the marriage as a measure of expediency for the security of the queen's person and government. Burleigh, in compliance with her commands, seconded their reasons, but not honestly. Leicester and Hatton did the same at first, but finally pretended to be converts to the strong arguments of Bromley, Sadler, Mildmay, and Sidney against it. On the 7th, they waited upon her majesty in a body, and requested to be informed of her pleasure on the subject, and they would endeavour to make themselves conformable to it. The queen, who expected to have been furnished with a legitimate excuse for following her own inclination, in the shape of a petition for her to marry, was surprised and offended at their caution, and, bursting into tears of anger and vexation, she reproached them for their long disputations, as if it were doubtful whether there would be more surety for her and her realm than if she were to marry and have a child of her own to inherit, and so to continue the line of Henry VIII. In conclusion, she condemned her own simplicity in committing so delicate a matter to them, for she had expected, she said, that they would have unanimously petitioned her to proceed with the marriage, rather than have made doubt of it, and being much troubled, she requested them to leave her till the afternoon. The afternoon found her majesty very ungraciously disposed. She used passionate and bitter vituperation against those who had opposed the match. She even endeavoured herself to refute the objections that had been made to it in council, and she issued an edict forbidding the matter to be touched upon in the pulpit by any preacher whatsoever. Burleigh, finding the queen was not to be crossed, openly compelled the council to assume a semblance of compliance with her wishes, by discussing of the marriage articles with the Duke of Anjou's procurator, Simiers. Nothing could, however, be more unpopular in England than the idea of such a marriage. Was the lawful heiress of the crown to be immured and kept in an hourly fear of death because she was a member of the Church of Rome, while the sovereign herself, the defender of the Protestant faith, wilfully endangered the stability of the newly established Church by entering into a matrimonial treaty with a Roman Catholic? The inconsistency and want of moral justice involved in such a proceeding was felt by the professors of every varying creed throughout the realm. The queen acknowledged, to a certain degree, the force of the objections of her subjects against the marriage, but was troubled with a perverse inclination to act according to her own pleasure in the matter. Deeply offended at the demurs of her cabinet, she asked the advice of the accomplished Sir Philip Sidney, who at that time filled the office of cup-bearer to her majesty, and from whom she probably expected to receive counsel more agreeable to her apparent wishes on the subject. Sir Philip Sidney, with all the graceful courtesy and elegance of a finished gentleman, possessed a lofty spirit of independence. He never condescended to practice the arts of courtier craft, and when his sovereign asked him to give her his opinion without disguise, he addressed to her a long and energetic letter, beginning, "Most feared and beloved, most sweet and gracious sovereign," after which honeyed words he proceeds to tell her many bold truths on the impolicy of the measure. "How the hearts of your people," says he, "will be galled, if not aliened, when they shall see you take a husband, a Frenchman and a papist, in whom the very common people know this, that he is the son of the Jezebel of our age, that his brother made oblation of his own sister's marriage, the easier to make massacre of our brethren in religion. As long as he is monsieur in might, and papist in profession, he neither can nor will greatly shield you, and if he grow to be king, his defense will be like Ajax's shield, which rather weighed down than defended those that bear it." The queen having solicited the opinion of Sidney, and respecting his integrity, had the philosophy to take his remonstrance in good part, but a terrible example of her vengeance had taken place, during the visit of Anjou, on a luckless bencher of Lincoln's Inn, named Stubbs, who presumed to write and publish at this crisis a book with the following quaint title: "The discovery of a gaping gulf, wherein England is like to be swallowed by another French marriage, if the Lord forbid not the banns, by letting her see the sin and the punishment thereof." The work contained, as may be supposed, a series of fierce vituperations against the unsuitableness of the alliance, and the choler of the writer was especially excited by the circumstance of Monsieur having paid her majesty a personal visit incognito. This Stubbs denounced as "an unmanlike, unprincelike, French kind of wooing." "This man," the duke, says he, "is a son of Henry II, whose family, ever since he married that Catharine of Italy, is fatal, as it were, to resist the gospel, and have been, every one after the other, as a Domitian after a Nero, etc. Here is, therefore, an imp of the crown of France to marry with the crown nymph of England." An expression by no means inelegant or uncomplimentary to the maiden monarch, now well stricken in years. The book was prohibited, the whole impression seized and burned, and the author, printer, and publisher were all proceeded against on a statute of Philip and Mary, although the lawyers stoutly contended such a statute was virtually null and void. Stubbs and his publisher had, nevertheless, to endure the barbarous sentence of the loss of their right hands, which were smitten off with a butcher's knife and mallet in the market place at Westminster. The conduct of Stubbs, at the most bitter moment of this disgusting execution, proves that the subjects of Elizabeth, even when suffering from her vindictive spirit for contradicting her will, assumed an extraordinary devotion of loyalty. "I remember," says Camden, "standing by John Stubbs, who, as soon as his right hand was off, took off his hat with his left, and cried aloud, 'God save the Queen!' He fainted the next moment. A long and vigorous imprisonment in the Tower was, nevertheless, added to the miseries of this brave but unfortunate gentleman." All this opposition, however, brought the marriage negotiation to a pause. Elizabeth had felt the force of Sidney's remonstrances, and even the fulminations of the hapless Stubbs had probably created misgivings. "If her highness mean to marry," writes Hatton to Walsingham, "I wonder she so delayeth it. If she do but temporize, and will leave it at the last, what may we look for then, but that the Pope, with Spain and France, will yoke themselves, in all ireful revenge, according to their solemn combination so long ago concluded on, against us." The fact was, that neither the French court, her ambassador there, nor her most trusted servants at home, could discover what were her real intentions in the matter. Whether she exactly knew them herself appears to be doubtful. "The marriage is on the book again," writes Sir George Bowes to his brother Robert, the treasurer of Berwick, "and her highness seemeth now as forward as ever she hath been at any time before, and yet Sir William Drury, whom we well know to be a setter forth of that cause, having occasion to ride unto the court on Thursday last, and using some speeches upon that matter to her majesty, did, with great reverence, inquire of her majesty's disposition that way, who, giving him a great clap of the shoulder with her hand, answered, 'I will never marry, but I will ever bear good will and favour to those who have liked and furthered the same.'" She meant those who had advocated the marriage. Among the great events of this period may be reckoned the death of Elizabeth's great minister, Sir Nicholas Bacon, generally distinguished by the title of my Lord Keeper. It is recorded, that when the queen visited him at his modest country residence, she was pleased to observe that his house was too little for him. "No, madame," replied he, "You have made me too big for my house." He afterwards had the honour of entertaining his royal mistress in his stately mansion of Gorhambury, which he built, probably in consequence of her remark on his former abode. Among the elaborate dainties which furnished forth the memorable banquet for the maiden monarch and her court, was a hog roasted whole, garnished with links of sausage, a queer culinary pun on the name of the learned host. Elizabeth one day asked Sir Nicholas Bacon "what he thought of a monopoly licence she had granted?" "Madam," he said, "if I must speak the truth, I will reply in the Latin proverb, Licentia omnes deteriore sumus. We are all the worse for licence." The splendid talents of his son, the learned and eloquent Francis Bacon, afterwards the great Lord Bacon of Verulam, early attracted the notice of Queen Elizabeth, who was wont to call him playfully her little Lord Keeper, and predicted that he would one day become a distinguished man. He proved, it is well known, one of the brightest ornaments of her reign, a diamond of unrivalled lustre, though not without a flaw. His records of Elizabeth are among the most favourable that contemporaries have preserved of her character. Eulogiums from such a source are calculated to make a strong impression on every reader, even when no supporting facts are given; and there can be little doubt that Elizabeth is indebted for much of her posthumous popularity to the powerful pen of Bacon. Like his father, he was a great advocate for the celibacy of his royal mistress. "Female reigns," says he, "are usually eclipsed by marriage, and all the glory transferred to the husband; while those queens, who live single, have none to share it with them. And this was more peculiarly the case of Queen Elizabeth, for she had no supporters of her government, but those of her own making; no brother, no uncle, nor any other of the royal family to partake her cares and assist her government. The ministers whom she advanced to places of trust, she kept so tight a rein upon, and so dispensed her favours, that they were continually solicitous to please her, while she ever remained mistress of herself." Like some of the most unfortunate monarchs, as Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Trajan, she was childless, and left no successors of her own issue, and it is a disputed point whether children augment felicity. She had her outward embellishments, a tall stature, a graceful shape, a most majestic aspect, mixed with sweetness, and a happy state of health. Besides, she was strong and vigorous to the last, experiencing as little the miseries of old age as the reverses of fortune. To fill up the measure of her felicity, she was happy not only in her own person, but also in the abilities and virtues of her ministers of state. If it should be here objected, as Cicero did to Caesar, "There is matter enough to admire, but I would gladly see somewhat to praise," I answer that true admiration is a superlative degree of praise. I shall, however, add a few words not on the morals and virtues of this queen, but only on such particulars as have occasioned some malicious tongues to traduce her. As to her religion, she was pious, moderate, constant, and an enemy to novelty. She was seldom absent from divine service and other duties of religion, either in her chapel or closet. She was very conversant in the scriptures and writings of the fathers, especially St. Augustine. She composed certain prayers on emergent occasions. When she mentioned the name of God, though in ordinary discourse, she generally added the title Creator, and composed her eyes and countenance to an expression of humility and reverence, which I have myself often observed. This observation is evidently urged in contradistinction to Elizabeth's well-known habit of profane swearing, in which she outdid her father, bluff King Hal, from whom she probably acquired that evil propensity. Her favourite expletive was, however, certainly derived from her first lover, the Lord Admiral, with whom it was in fearfully familiar use, as those who have read the state papers collected by Haynes, and also by Tytler, must be aware. But expressions which startle us even from the lips of a bad man, appear to the last degree revolting when used in common parlance by a female, especially a princess, whose piety is still a favourite theme with many writers. In illustration of Elizabeth's inconsiderate habit in this respect, we give the evidence of a contemporary, who appears neither shocked nor surprised at the coarse manners of the maiden monarch. Curiosity, says Lord Herbert of Cherbury, rather than ambition brought me to court, and as it was the manner of those times for all men to kneel before the great Queen Elizabeth, who then reigned, I was likewise upon my knees in the presence chamber when she passed by to the chapel at Whitehall. As soon as she saw me she stopped, and swearing her usual oath, demanded, "Who is this?" Everybody there present looked upon me, but none knew me, till Sir James Croft, a pensioner, finding the queen stayed, returned back and told who I was, and that I was married to Sir W. Herbert of St. Gillian's daughter. The queen looked attentively at me, and swearing again her ordinary oath, said, "It is pity he married so young," and thereupon gave me her hand to kiss twice, both times gently patting my cheek. This license has been attributed to the grossness of the age. That age produced the daughters and granddaughters of Sir Thomas More, Catharine Parr, Lady Jane Grey, Sidney's sisters, and many other spotless examples of female purity and refinement. And for the honour of the ladies of the 16th century, it may be presumed that the use of oaths was a characteristic of Elizabeth rather than of her times. As to what was reported, continues Lord Bacon, that she was altogether so unmindful of mortality as not to bear the mention of death or old age, it is absolutely false. For several years before her death she would often facetiously call herself the old woman, and discourse about what epitaph she would like, adding, that she was no lover of pompous titles, but only desired that her name might be recorded in a line or two, which should briefly express her name, her virginity, the years of her reign, the reformation of religion under it, and her preservation of peace. It is true that in the flower of her age, being importuned to declare her successor, she answered, that she could by no means endure a shroud to be held before her eyes while she was living. And yet some time before her death, when she was pensive, and probably meditating on her mortality, a person familiar with her, observing that several great offices were vacant, and had been kept so too long, she rose up hastily, and said, with unusual warmth, that she was sure her place would not long be vacant. She hated vice, and studied to preserve an honourable fame. Thus, for example, having once ordered a dispatch to be written to her ambassador, which he was to communicate privately to the Queen Mother of France, Catherine de Medicis, her secretary had inserted a compliment for the ambassador to use, importing, that they were two queens from whose experience in the arts of government no less was expected than of the greatest kings. Queen Elizabeth could not bear the comparison, but forbade it to be sent, observing, "She used very different arts of government from the Queen Mother of France." The commendation that best pleased her was, if any one declared that she would have been distinguished by her virtues and abilities if her station had been in private life, so unwilling was she to owe her distinction merely to her royal station. To speak the truth, pursues this eloquent eulogist, the only proper encomiast of this princess is time, which during the ages it has run, never produced her like for the government of a kingdom. Elizabeth's regnal talents were shown in the acuteness of her perceptive powers and the unerring discrimination with which she selected her ministers and great law officers, and in some instances converted those into loyal servants who might have turned their abilities to her annoyance. It is a tradition in the Egerton family that she was once in court when Thomas Egerton, a distinguished barrister, was pleading against the crown side, in some action in the Court of Queen's Bench. She was so much struck with his eloquence and professional skill, that she exclaimed, "By my troth, he shall never plead against me again." She immediately appointed him Queen's Counsel, in modern parlance, gave him a silk gown. He attained the dignities of Solicitor General and Lord Keeper in her reign. In the spring of 1580, the queen thought proper to check the presumptuous dispositions of her subjects, to emulate the height and amplitude of the royal ruff, which formed so characteristic a feature in her costume, and an act was passed in Parliament, empowering certain officials to stand at corners of the streets, armed with shears, for the purpose of clipping all ruffs that exceeded the size prescribed by this droll sumptuary law, and also to shorten the rapiers of all gentlemen who persisted in wearing them of an unsuitable length. During the progress of this forcible reformation in the dimensions of ruffs and rapiers, the French ambassador, Mauvissiere, chancing to recreate himself with a morning ride in Smithfield, was stopped at the bars by the officers who sat there to cut swords, who insisted on shortening his rapier, which exceeded the limits prescribed by the recent statute. To impugn the taste of a Frenchman in any matter connected with his dress is attacking him on a point of peculiar importance, but for the clownish officials of the Smithfield bars to presume to make a forcible alteration in the costume of the man who represented the whole majesty of France was an outrage not to be endured even by the veteran statesman Mauvissiere de Castelnau. He drew his threatened rapier, instead of surrendering it to the dishonouring shears of the officers, and sternly stood on the defensive, and but for the seasonable interposition of Lord Henry Seymour, who luckily was likewise taking the air in Smithfield, and hastened to rescue the insulted ambassador from the hands of the executive powers, evil consequences might have followed. Mauvissiere complained to the queen, and her majesty greatly censured the officers for their want of discrimination in attempting to clip so highly privileged a person. At the same time that Elizabeth was so actively employed in retrenching any extraordinary deviations from good taste in her subjects, she had a most singular purchase made for her at Mechlin of 6 Hungarian horses to draw her coach. These creatures were of a light grey colour, with their manes and tails dyed orange. Perhaps the aggrieved parties, whose sword points and ruffs had just been clipped, might have thought that the flaming orange manes and tails of the queen's coach horses were quite as outrageous in regard to taste as long rapiers and high frills. This year the queen took the alarm at the rapid increase of her metropolis, and prohibited any new dwelling house to be built within 3000 paces of the gates of London, upon pain of imprisonment and forfeiture of the materials brought for the erection of such an edifice, and forbade any one to have more than one family in a house. The latter clause in this arbitrary and inconvenient regulation might have been called an act for the suppression of lodgings. In November, the celebrated navigator, Francis Drake, returned from his great voyage of discovery round the globe, and in the following spring the queen did him the honour of going on board his ship at Deptford, where she partook of a collation, knighted him, and consented to share the golden fruits of his succeeding adventures. As some of Drake's enterprises were of a decidedly piratical character, and attended with some circumstances of plunder and cruelty to the infant colonies of Spain, the policy of Elizabeth in sanctioning his deeds is doubtful. In a moral point of view it appears unjustifiable. The English nobles, to whom Drake offered costly presents of gold and silver plate, refused to accept them, which, says Camden, angered him exceedingly, as it implied an intimation that they had not been honourably acquired. The Spanish court demanded restitution of the spoils, but in vain. Drake commenced his career in life as the apprentice to a pilot at Upnor, who finally bequeathed to him his little bark, which proved the foundation of his fortunes. After he had received the honour of knighthood from his sovereign, he assumed the heraldic device of 3 wyverns, the family coat of Sir Bernard Drake, the representative of an ancient house of that name. Sir Bernard Drake, who disclaimed all affinity with the crestless stock from which his valiant namesake sprang, considered this a great piece of impertinence, and, the first time he met him, gave him a box on the ears, and demanded, by what right had he presumed to assume his family arms? Sir Francis took the blow patiently, and explained that he had assumed the wyverns as the general device of the name of Drake. Sir Bernard fiercely rejoined, that he was the only Drake who had a right to bear the wyverns, adding a contemptuous allusion to the origin of the new knight, and his folly in pretending to any arms. Sir Francis appealed to the queen, who told him, that he had earned better arms for himself, which he should bear by her especial favour. She accordingly gave him an elaborate shield, charged, among other devices, with a ship, in the shrouds of which a wyvern was hanging up by the heels, intended as a retaliation of the indignity which had been offered to him by his proud namesake. The next time they encountered, Sir Francis Drake asked his adversary, "What he thought of the arms the queen had given him?" "The queen," rejoined the sturdy old knight, "may have given you finer arms than mine, but she neither has given you, nor could give you, a right to bear the three wiverns, the cognizance of my ancient house." Section 32.